Now we're going to do the second video of our hospital series, and we're going to be starting with LBJ. LBJ is now the president after Kennedy was shot. LBJ comes from rural Texas. He came from a very poor background in Texas, and you got to think about this. If he came into Congress in the 1930s, then probably who was his hero? If he's a Democrat from Texas, came from poverty and so forth, and he became a congressman in the 1930s, then his hero is going to be FDR, right? So he's a big FDR supporter, big New Deal type person as a politician. So he's in office in Congress in the 1930s, eventually works his way to the Senate, and by the mid-1950s, he's the Senate Majority Leader. So he has a lot of influence and power in the Senate, has a lot of experience with the Senate, getting things accomplished there as well, too. For example, we're going to come back to this later on, but some of the things that he was able to do that Kennedy was not was, number one, pass some tax cuts that Kennedy had been proposing. So in '64, LBJ is going to be able to pass some tax cuts that Kennedy had wanted to pass. And then secondly, and the big one is that he is able to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And we'll talk more of this when we get to civil rights, but Kennedy tried his hardest to try to get the civil rights stuff passed, and wasn't doing enough to convince Congress and so forth. But when LBJ becomes president, he's able to get these civil rights bills passed, and the first one being in 1964. So that's a big accomplishment of LBJ. He does do tax cuts. The tax cuts do help the economy because it allows people to do more spending, which is good up front. Like, all the tax cuts are great at the time, but once we add on his later programs and we also add on the Vietnam War, things are not so great for the economy by the end of the 60s. But at that point, the tax cuts that he created were not that bad. His first major program was called the War on Poverty. So in August of '64, about 4 months prior to the general election, what he try to make a name for himself in that 1 year he has from Kennedy is that he tries to pass this program called the War on Poverty. He was inspired by a book called The Other America, which you don't really need to be aware of, but he was inspired by this book called The Other America, which helped focus on these 40 million Americans living in poverty. So you had The Affluent Society, that came out in the late 50s. You have The Other America, which comes out in the early 60s. And all these work towards influencing Kennedy and then later LBJ when it comes to poverty issues. So in August of '64, LBJ declares an unconditional war on poverty. So in August of '64, LBJ goes to war on poverty. Now, we know today poverty still exists, so he doesn't win a war on poverty. But does this program dramatically reduce poverty over time? Yes. Poverty was basically cut in half. There's like 22% poverty in America whenever he takes over office in '63, '64. And then by a few years down the road, after he makes all these different programs, it's down to 11%. So he does make dramatic cuts to poverty, but does not beat poverty for all time. So in August of '64, he creates what's called the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is part of his War on Poverty program. So it's called the Office of Economic Opportunity, and it got $1 billion budget. So this program got a $1 billion budget to fund all its minor programs and so forth. It sponsored a variety of self-help programs that help the poor. So they're all directed towards helping the poor, helping people who are in poverty. Head Starts is probably the most famous. There's still Head Starts today. These are like kind of pre-K centers. They're government-sponsored pre-K centers. So if you've been to a Head Start or you know what Head Starts are, there's one there. At least there was one at one point in Port Hudson. I don't know if they're still there or not. But they're government-made pre-K programs that give students, especially ones who are in poverty, a head start when it comes to education. He also created Job Corps programs to teach vocational tech jobs to people. The government sponsored these types of skills. Created literacy programs to teach people how to read. Also provided free legal services for people in poverty communities. And the idea behind the idea behind the War on Poverty in his later programs is not trying to just be like, here's some immediate relief. Here's $30 this month, or here's whatever. As opposed to doing that, which might be a temporary fix, his goal was to do long-term solutions. That's why he's doing things like Head Starts, Job Corps, and job training and legal fees. That way that people can better themselves down the road, because if you can better yourself down the road, then one day you can buy a better house, get a better job, those kind of things. It also, the War on Poverty also created community action programs as well. and it allowed the poor to run these anti-poverty programs in their own neighborhoods. So the community action programs actually allowed the poor themselves to run these programs in their own neighborhood, since they knew the neighborhood the best. Some of these programs produced results, some did not. It changes throughout the decade. We're going to see what affects these programs, but it does dramatically reduce poverty. It doesn't end it, but it does dramatically reduce the amount of poverty in the country. Then the election of 1964. So again, he's only president for 1 year before he does run for president. So the Democrats do nominate him for the presidency in 64. His vice president was a Senator Hubert Humphrey, who we might address later down the road, but not really somebody you have to really know that much about. And LBJ decides to propose a very liberal agenda. So when he runs, he's running as a pretty liberal politician with a very liberal agenda as far as what he wants to see the government accomplish. Now, what's important about this election, this is not a huge election, but it's going to be important down the road for other things that are happening. In 1964, you have an important candidate run for the Republicans named Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is a senator from Arizona. He was not, and it kind of reflects a little bit this year's election. He didn't reflect the majority of people's opinion about politics, or he didn't really represent the majority of his own party. But he was the guy they decided upon in the 1964 convention. So Barry Goldwater suggests this extremely conservative program. The Republicans you've seen for the past 20, 30 years were not that super conservative. Even back in the day, back in the 1920s and so on, even before that, they weren't as defined. I mean, they weren't the same party as they are now. Barry Goldwater, his platform of this very conservative government, cutting all the spending, cutting all taxes, and so forth, reflects. It's the beginning of the reflection of the modern Republican Party. So Barry Goldwater does a lot to help start shifting people towards the modern day Republican Party that exists now. So anyway, so Barry Goldwater hated the New Deal. He hated the welfare state. He wanted to end all this. He wanted to end programs like Social Security. He wanted to end TVA. All those things that go back to FDR. One of the most famous things that come from this, and if again I have time later on, I'll show you this, is the Daisy TV ad from this election. What's also happening in the 64 election is that Vietnam has all of a sudden become a big issue. So they are talking about Vietnam. Goldwater's talking about doing things like nuclear bombing Vietnam, which of course Johnson, his party, don't really support at all. And so there's a very famous ad that ran one time called the Daisy ad, where it's this little girl picking petals off a flower, and all of a sudden you hear this nuclear countdown, and it basically the idea is like, what if she died in this a nuclear attack, whatever. And so it was a critique of Barry Goldwater's campaign promoting this nuclear attacks and so on. But Goldwater doesn't win, obviously, and Johnson wins his own full term and wins by a landslide. But what's important is you look at the map. You look at the map, he doesn't just pull his home state of Arizona. Barry Goldwater also pulls a lot of southern states. So you're seeing, again, Southern conservatives being upset with the more liberal Democratic Party. And so in this election, you see a lot of southern states pick Republican and voting that way. So you're seeing the beginnings of that trend happening here with the Barry Goldwater election in 64. Also, as a result of this election, Democrats control 2/3 of Congress, so which tells you that LBJ can pretty much pass whatever he wants inside of Congress. So now he's made the war on poverty. He's gotten reelected. He sees this as a mandate, a large mandate, to pass out his more liberal reform. So he's going to create this program called the Great Society. So in 65, his second program wave is called the Great Society, which is the biggest liberalization of the government, the biggest effect on the government since the New Deal. So again, his hero is FDR. He wanted to continue the tradition of the New Deal and all those programs of the 30s, and so now he does this new wave of programs in the 1960s called the Great Society, and this is his big lasting legacy. So this is where liberalism reaches its peak, because after this point, when we go to the 70s, 80s, and today, you're seeing people push much more towards conservatism, or at least being more moderate. But back in these days, they're pushing to be much more liberal. The two biggest legacies of the Great Society, the two biggest programs, and on a side note, there are a lot of programs just like the New Deal, where it's like this act, that act, and so on. But unlike the New Deal, you don't have to know them all by name. There's only a few that you have to actually know by name. So if you look them up on a book or on the internet, you can actually see the names of the programs, but there's only a handful you have to actually kind of be aware of directly what they were. So the first area he addressed was healthcare, and the two big ones that come out under LBJ are Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare and Medicaid are the two big ones that he creates, which, as you know today, is also a tax that comes out of your paychecks. If you have a job, you pay Social Security taxes out of your paycheck, but you also pay Medicare and Medicaid. And it works very similar to the idea that you're not setting that money aside, it's being put into a massive pot that goes to everybody that's using it right now. So the difference is Medicare is government health care insurance for the elderly, 65 and older. So Medicare, if you're eligible, you can apply for it and you can get it, and it's health care insurance by the government for 65 and older. So Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid, spelled A-I-D, Medicaid, is for people receiving welfare. So Medicaid, is for people receiving welfare, or people who are at the lower poverty level. They can receive this type of government-provided health care insurance if they can't afford it on their own. So these two programs that we start paying out of our checks to in our taxes and so forth, then we still pay to it now. And as of today, if you look at our two biggest contributors to the national debt, the number one now is Medicare and Medicaid. It used to be number two, but number two, which was number one, is Social Security. So those two programs combined, which we pay taxes out of, are two biggest contributors to our national debt, because there's so many people, baby boomers, who are taking a lot of the money. Number three is defense, and number three is pretty, not, I wouldn't say far back, but it's not a close third place to these other programs. But that's our kind of our top three debts that we owe and so forth. So make sure you know those two programs come out under the Great Society. Those are two big ones that you definitely be aware of. He also creates another program, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So another part of the Great Society is what was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which finally passed this idea of giving federal tax dollars to public schools. Something that Truman had tried, something that JFK had tried, and both had failed. But LBJ, having this abilities to know how to negotiate with Congress and get all these different things passed, passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which gave a lot of federal tax dollars, which we receive, Zachary High does, and most public schools do, receive some form of tax dollars to help support materials, programs, hiring teachers, whatever the case is, because not every state has the same amount of money, so this allows states to have a better chance of being more equalized. So those are some of the bigger ones. Some of the other areas that the Great Society addresses, there's new immigration laws in this time period. They finally get rid of the quotas, so they actually relieve a lot of those old quota laws and things that have been plaguing our country since the 1920s. We also try to increase opportunities of trade with Latin America. He made this National Foundation of the Arts and Humanities, which you don't have to be aware of, which gave federal funding to creative projects and scholarly projects and so forth. Creates two new cabinet positions, Department of Transportation, so which is still around. Department of Transportation he creates to deal with, now you have interstates and those kind of things, so addressing those types of concerns. And he also creates the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. So he also creates a second cabinet post, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which he appoints a guy named Andrew Young. Andrew Young is the first black cabinet member. So LBJ in the 60s appoints, as the first Secretary of HUD, the first African American, Andrew Young, to fill that position. So that's significant in itself too. He also does funding for urban renewal projects. That's one of the earliest concerns of HUD is to have federal money going towards urban renewal projects. So you're seeing Congress also providing funding for higher education, public housing, crime prevention, all these different ideas. But the whole idea of the Great Society was to address poverty. That's like the big underlying issues, addressing poverty and trying to support people who are living in poverty. And we still do a lot of these programs today because at the time, the programs might have been great had they been fully developed, but with Vietnam coming in, it's going to divert money away from these programs. It's going to hurt the Great Society. So those are some of the big ideas when it comes to the Great Society. Some new areas that are addressed by the Great Society that's new for society in general and the government is in the environment as well as public safety. So Congress under the Great Society also regulated automobile industry. One book that's important was called Unsafe at Any Speed. Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader, who ran for president a few years ago. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, made people aware just how dangerous cars can be, and made people want to seek out more government laws creating safety regulations and codes for vehicles. You also get two important pollution acts called the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts passed by Congress because of a book by Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, who you do need to be aware of for the AP test, Rachel Carson wrote this book called Silent Spring about the dangers of pesticide and how they're polluting us and could hurt us and maybe give us cancer or sometimes sicknesses. And so the Great Society is also addressing these new areas of like public safety as well as pollution with the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, because still companies are just dumping things where they wanted to, dumping them to lakes, dumping them to fields and so forth. And so this puts stronger restrictions on where people could dump things and dump things in water, pollute the air, and puts more restrictions on cars, how much gases they emit, those kind of things. So now we're starting to see, especially in the 60s, a greater push for environmental concerns. We're going to see that an ongoing trend going into the 1970s. But you do need to be aware of the name Rachel Carson as far as her influence over becoming aware of DDT, pesticides, and leading towards the Clean Air and Water Act. Even the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, that was her nickname, Lady Bird. Lady Bird Johnson also had this campaign called Beautify America. So she also put this big promotional campaign about trying to improve the standards of America too. So we'll stop video 2 there.